Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to talk about a massive shift that's happening right now in the US federal workforce. But we're not just going to look at the numbers. We're going to get into the really personal, often overlooked human side of what it means to leave a career in public service. So to give you an idea of the scale we're talking about, get this. In 2025 alone, it's projected that over 317,000 employees are going to leave their federal jobs. That is not a small change. That's a huge wave. And behind that giant number, well, there are hundreds of thousands of individual stories. And that brings us to the real mystery here. Why is it that so many incredibly smart, dedicated people, people who have shaped major policies and run huge programs, feel completely adrift the second they walk out the door of the system they've served for years? This quote from a former policy analyst just says it all. She says, "My confidence evaporated, not because I lacked talent, but because the system that had defined me was gone." It's not about their skills suddenly disappearing. It's about the entire scaffolding of their professional identity just vanishing. It's a crisis of confidence, and it catches so many people completely by surprise. So, to really get a handle on this crisis of confidence, we have to look past the spreadsheets and statistics. We need to dig into the personal stories and understand what this transition actually feels like for the real people going through it. To do that, we're going to look at 5 different people, from a top executive all the way to a contractor, to see how the same pattern shows up again and again. This will really help us get to the heart of the problem. Okay, first up, let's meet a GS-13 policy analyst. In the federal world, that's a senior-level pro, someone with a ton of experience. She's been there for almost 2 decades, doing incredible work, and she decides to take an early retirement buyout. You'd think, hey, that's a great reward for a long, successful career, right? Well, the moment she sat down to write a resume for a private sector job, she just froze. All the language she used to define her success, things like GS grades, policy memos, interagency work, it was like speaking a foreign language to the outside world. Her entire sense of self was so tied to her role that she literally couldn't explain her value in a new environment. Next, let's look at a GS7 program support specialist. This is one of those people who is the quiet, competent engine of the office. She's the one who makes everything run smoothly. She'd been doing it for 6 years, and then suddenly her position was eliminated in what's called a reduction in force, or a RIF. So immediately, the financial pressure was on. She started blasting out dozens of applications every single day. But here's the thing. When she got into interviews, she found herself saying things like she was just a support specialist. The panic to get a paycheck was making her downplay her own skills, putting her on a path to a career downgrade she didn't deserve. Our third story is about a federal contractor. Now, for 9 years, she was the go-to person in her office, the one everybody relied on. But she never had an official government title. And then one day, her contract was terminated, with just 2 weeks' notice. And her story really shows you the deep psychological effect of the government's hierarchy. In her first job interview, she was up against someone who was a GS-12, and she felt defeated before she even said a word. For years, she'd been conditioned to think of herself as just a contractor, an outsider. What she couldn't see was that her practical, get-it-done experience was exactly what private companies are desperate for. All right, now let's go all the way to the top of the food chain. We're talking about a senior executive, an SES. This is basically the government's version of a C-suite executive. For more than 25 years, his title carried immense weight. He managed massive budgets, navigated complex politics. He was a big deal. But when he stepped into the private sector, his rank meant, well, almost nothing. Suddenly, interviewers were asking him about culture fit, not his GS level. He had this shocking realization that the authority he was so used to was tied to the government structure he just left. He learned the hard way that leadership is spoken in different dialects, and he just wasn't fluent anymore. And our last story is about a mid-career technical specialist. For 10 years, she was the hero keeping critical systems online with barely any resources. She was completely burned out, so she voluntarily quit. And she thought, finally, I'm free. But that relief didn't last long. See, her whole career had been about reacting to emergencies, not about strategically planning for herself. So worried about her savings, she just grabbed the very first job offer she got. And what do you know? 6 months later, she was right back in another toxic, burnout job. She was great at escaping a bad situation, but she never learned the skills to actually choose a good one. Okay, So we've just seen 5 very different people from very different roles, all hitting the same wall, this crushing crisis of confidence. This is not about individual weakness. It's a pattern, and it points to something much bigger, a major blind spot in the system itself. And that brings us to this critical idea: under-informed by design. This is the common thread that ties all these stories together. These public servants aren't incapable. Far from it. They were expertly trained for success inside a very specific closed system. But that same system gave them zero tools, no language, no frameworks to confidently navigate the world outside of it. And this all breaks down into 4 key truths. First, they worked in a closed system, one that just doesn't teach you how to translate your skills to the outside world. Second, their identity gets completely anchored to their job title and rank, not to their actual value. Third, because they're so competent inside the system, they totally underestimate how unprepared they are for the messy, ambiguous private sector job market. And fourth, as we saw again and again, that pressure, both financial and emotional, makes them confused, panicked, urgent moves with a real, thoughtful strategy. And let's just be crystal clear about this, because it's so important. This is not a personal failure. It is a systemic issue. It is a fundamental blind spot in how we think about a career in public service. The system literally prepares you for everything except the day you have to leave it. So if we all agree this is a system-level problem, then what does a system-level solution actually look like? How do we make sure people can leave with the respect and dignity they've absolutely earned? Well, right now, the support people get is almost all administrative. It's about checking boxes, filling out paperwork, maybe a quick resume review. It basically manages your exit. But what's really needed is human-centered support. That means focusing on that huge identity shift, teaching people how to make strategic decisions, and helping them get their sense of control back. It's not about managing an exit. It's about building the capability for whatever comes next. And that leaves us with this final, really important question. For the hundreds of thousands of people who've given their careers to serving the public, how do we finally build a system that honors that service? One that makes sure their career ends not with fear and confusion, but with the dignity, purpose, and confidence they so richly deserve.